I think we really take for granted now, especially with streaming. There was a time when rock was rock and roll, pop music was pop music, R&B was R&B, hip hop was hip hop, and you didn't blur those lines. Certain radio stations wouldn't play hip hop. Mariah Carey, you made it cool for rappers to jump on R&B tracks, on pop tracks. You were one of the pioneers of this.
For the first half of the 1990s, Mariah Carey was trapped in a tug-of-war between the urban-inspired music she intuitively gravitated towards and the adult contemporary cookie-cutter category Columbia knew was more financially feasible. Her debut single Vision of Love showcased the R&B sounds Mariah fought to include, and although it went to #1 on the Black chart first,
that song went #1 on the R&B charts, which were then called the Black charts, first. Right. Before it went #1 on the pop charts, because it really isn't a pop record.
The label continuously pushed Mariah towards conventional pop. However, off the huge success and impact of her debut album, their control relinquished momentarily, and Mariah wrote, produced and released the diverse, soulful second album, Emotions. Unfortunately, due to its commercial underperformance, a non-threatening adult contemporary girl next door image was pushed even harder. The pursuit by the label, and in particular Tommy Mottola, to mold Mariah into the clean Disney princess of 90s pop was unrelenting, and with the power he flaunted in the music industry and the control he exerted in his quote inappropriate relationship and marriage to Mariah Carey, the control was ubiquitous. Mariah's mixed race background was being systematically erased, just as her success was reaching global status.
So many people have always just gone like, oh, Mariah makes music that black people enjoy, everyone enjoys, but she's not black. People who you wanted to belong to sometimes didn't even know that you were part of the tribe.
Her third album, Music Box, not only soared in her native United States, it blew up in Europe, a territory that only saw sporadic impact in the past. And yet, the album was viewed by many as a sanitized, calculated version of the real Mariah, plastic commercial soul. Now, these issues are discussed in more detail in the previous videos in this series, and if you'd like to take a look, they're on my channel. Now, an interesting detour in Carey's career is her Christmas album of 1995. And in retrospect, the album was not just a festive gift for the season, but a gift in helping to actualize more candid creative endeavors. An important component of this record was the inclusion of gospel. Tommy Mottola appreciated jazz and gospel under certain circumstances. A Christmas album could exist independent to an album of original material. Inspired choirs and church-influenced sound was included on most tracks. Mariah also returned to her signature runs and riffs, absent on most of Music Box. Again, the label most likely allowed this because a Christmas album is an anomaly that could coexist outside the rules of branding Mariah as a safe pop singer. It is, after all, a Christian-orientated album, therefore church influences, and in Mariah's case, the Black Church, could shine brighter than they had on Music Box. Now, this soulful choice was met with mixed reviews. Some critics loved it, some critics once again complaining that Carey's vocals were over the top and narcissistic. However, many of these same journalists critiqued her lack of melisma on Music Box, highlighting their own lack of objectivity in the world of music critics. However, one review stands out from the Boston Globe, arguing that Carey had abandoned the overly polished sound of her previous record and cut loose with unbridled soul. Carey was making music she loved, not necessarily music that was commercially marketable. Because let's remind ourselves, pop stars rarely made albums at the peak of their career. As a result, one could argue that Merry Christmas was a precursor, a mental push for Carey in continuing to record material aligned to her own taste. In many ways, the authenticity in her Christmas music could be seen as a push towards authenticity in her music overall. And hip-hop was always at the root of Carey's musical core.
I was just trying to express myself. I grew up in New York. If you listen to the radio, you heard all these incredible hip-hop records. I wanted to incorporate those beats into records that I was making because that's what I liked. It was my personal taste.
However, to understand the ongoing opposition in allowing this to be included in her music, we need to look at the cultural context. Since its proto days in the early 70s with The Revolution Will Not Be Televised to NWA and their controversial lyrics on police brutality, an inherent political thread ran through much of hip-hop. As a result, the power systems of music often saw the genre and lifestyle as a substantial threat to their control and authority. Hip-hop was raw, rebellious, radical, and it didn't necessarily need a Tommy Mottola hitmaker to flourish. It's not surprising that many were intimidated by its influence and how it could endanger the status quo of control in the industry. And to add fuel to the fire, the pro-sex lyrics that permeated hip-hop were seen as deeply obscene to the conservative moral guardians of the media. As Rolf Potts points out in The Great Rap Censorship Scare of 1990, large efforts were made to squash these new hip-hop acts. Moral panic engulfed the nation, as Jack Thompson, a conservative lawyer, spearheaded a campaign to restrict sales of certain albums. An FBI assistant director condemned NWA for encouraging violence against the police force, and since off-duty police officers often doubled as concert security personnel, promoters found it increasingly difficult to put on NWA concerts. The transgressive provocations were in direct opposition to the pristine world of pop. This ongoing push for censorship led rock and roll pioneer Little Richard to give a passionate, rousing appearance on Arsenio Hall in 1990.
See, this country was built on freedom of speech. If they want to sing whatever they sing, I may not like it, but I ain't got to buy it. I may not listen to it, but they have a right to sing it. You understand me? That's your right. Your freedom of being taken, stand up for it.
In many ways, the pushback of hip-hop mirrored the outrage and alarm of early rock and roll, and the disco sucks movement, spearheaded by white rockers who were threatened by the pro-sex disco phenomenon that gave creative power to Black, Latin, and gay minorities. The industry in many ways was repeating itself and trying to limit the growth of a new rebellious sound. And yet, Mariah had tried for years to actively include rappers in her music. The organ solo in Dream Lover, for example, was originally the space for a hip-hop artist.
Just from listening to Dream Lover, which is it was slightly whitewashed, rather than, when we put the organ solo and all that. It's nostalgic, but I know that that's there because I wanted a rapper to be on that part, but nobody was ready for that.
Unfortunately, this was not in keeping with the presentation of Mariah as the Doris Day of 90s pop. However, although the ideals of the Columbia record executives may not have aligned with hip-hop, their bank accounts did, and it was undeniable that the genre was making serious money and fast, becoming the best-selling American music genre by the mid-90s. The Wu-Tang Clan, Salt-N-Pepa, B.I.G., Tupac, and countless others had become the dominant force in the zeitgeist. And Mary J. Blige was hailed as the queen of hip-hop soul, thanks to Puff Daddy's behind-the-scenes vision and Blige's stark and honest storytelling accentuated over a strong beat and soulful delivery. The 80s pop rain that spilled over into the 90s wasn't dying, it was already dead. Even pop royalties like Madonna were moving out of pop and towards a more urban landscape, working with Babyface on the #1 hit Take a Bow, exploring R&B in a more upfront manner. Pop was dying, and urban music was moving into that landscape, that chasm left behind. And Mottola was a shrewd businessman. He knew Mariah had an ear for making hits, and he knew trends were quickly veering towards a sound he didn't understand. Under these fast-moving conditions and free-falling changes of power, Mariah's next album was released, Daydream, and in the next episode, we'll look at its enormous cultural impact, enormous success, and enormous influence on Mariah's pursuit to freedom. Hi, I'm Diva Talk, and thanks for watching.